The police car was approaching as Clyde Shelton began to take off his clothes. By the time the police burst through the door, he was completely naked. This was the only way to prove that he had no weapon to threaten the police. He seemed to have a good understanding of the law, but his calm gaze and leisurely demeanor indicated that the game had just begun. As he went downstairs, Clyde was challenging the American justice system, unaware to the police officers. They discovered a whole law library in Clyde's home. Notably the U.S. Code. Initially they thought Clyde was a lawyer. But when Nick, the assistant district attorney, unexpectedly found records related to a case he had handled with the criminal Darby 10 years ago, he remembered that this man was actually a law-abiding citizen. Clyde once had a well-behaved daughter and a beautiful wife, but on that fateful night 2 robbers broke into his home. Darby had gagged the little girl while and had tightly bound Clyde. They interacted with Clyde by stabbing him in the stomach. Not stopping there, they also interacted with Clyde's wife right in front of him. Clyde helplessly witnessed his 2 loved ones leave forever on that fateful night. Darby's brutal actions were even unbearable for his accomplice. What's noteworthy is that Clyde had hoped the law could bring justice for his wife and daughter. However, due to a lack of evidence at the scene, the case was likely to be lost. To ensure a higher chance of winning the case, Nick Rise negotiated with the mastermind Darby. Darby only needed to testify and he would receive a sentence of just 3 years in prison. Meanwhile, his accomplice Rupert Ahead was charged with murder and sentenced to death after 10 years in prison. Darby swaggered, flaunting his victory. He even shook hands with Nick Rise in front of the reporters. When the system was functioning normally, everything was fine. This outcome was something Clyde could not accept. If the law could not bring him justice, then he had to use his own means to ensure that the criminals faced appropriate punishment. 10 years later, Clyde was ready for revenge. The official retribution began when his accomplice And was executed. And was tightly restrained and a syringe was plunged into his vein. After removing the bandage, 3 different drugs were injected into the criminal's body according to procedure. The man who should have departed peacefully suddenly became violently agitated. He thrashed in pain until his entire body turned purple and he died. This was fundamentally not an execution, it was clearly a murder. The police quickly investigated the cause. It turned out that the injected drugs had been switched with poison by someone. Moreover, the vial had the inscription, "You cannot escape fate." This made Nick immediately recall the taunt that the mastermind Darby had once said to him in court. "I told you that you cannot escape fate, didn't I?" Thanks to this clue, the police immediately prepared to arrest Darby. However, at that moment, Darby received a call from a mysterious person telling him to flee quickly. At first, Darby didn't believe it until he saw the police cars outside the window, prompting him to run for his life. He even fired wildly at the police. Then the mysterious person told him to discard the gun and find a police car along the designated route. Darby approached the car window and looked inside. Just as the mysterious person had said, there was an unconscious police officer inside. The criminal hurriedly got into the car and pulled out the police officer's gun, lifting the damn thing up. "Bring it here, we'll start this damned vehicle," he said. The police car sped away under the watchful eye of the criminal Darby. The police officer had helped Darby escape the police's encirclement, but what happened next would make Darby regret it for the rest of his life. He intended to deal with the police officer right in front of him, but at that moment his phone rang. The caller was the mysterious person who had helped him escape. As he expressed his gratitude, the police officer in front of him said exactly those words. The mysterious person on the phone was the police officer before him. The officer removed his uniform to reveal his true identity. It turned out to be Clyde Shelton. "You took her away from me." Darby hurriedly fired his gun, only to discover that it was unloaded. Immediately he froze in place, unable to move. It turned out that the gun had been coated with the toxin from a pufferfish. Now Darby was poisoned. Although his nervous system still had sensation, he couldn't control his body. At that moment, as Darby regained consciousness, he realized he was bound tightly from head to toe. This was Clyde's masterpiece. He wanted this scoundrel to experience the feeling of being torn into 100 pieces. To prevent Darby from dying too soon, Clyde injected him with glucose followed by adrenaline. This way Darby would be alert and able to feel the impending pain. To ensure he wouldn't bite his tongue, Clyde also performed a special surgery to protect his jaw and used a knife to cut his eyelids so he couldn't close his eyes. Clyde even prepared a mirror for Darby so he could witness the entire process of his body being manipulated. Clyde wanted him to experience the ultimate helplessness, just like 10 years ago when he watched Darby harm his wife and daughter. As Darby had once said, "I cannot escape fate, everything is ready." Clyde put on a mask and turned on the camera. The real-life horror movie officially began. Meanwhile, District Attorney Nick, based on the detail of the switched poison in the previous execution of the accomplice, noticed something suspicious. He found that all the cases caused by Darby shared a common trait. They were simple and brutal, but the case of his accomplice was clearly a crime of intellect. While he was suspicious, Nick received a call from the police. In a remote warehouse, they had discovered Darby's body. To be precise, it was the pieces of Darby, 8,835 pieces, and it was truly gruesome. Clyde was the prime suspect because the warehouse was owned by him. Furthermore, the victim was the mastermind behind the case from years ago. This blatant act of revenge prompted the police to immediately proceed with Clyde's arrest. Facing the police pursuit, Clyde seemed to have been prepared for a long time. For Clyde, being arrested and sent to prison was just the beginning of the game. Next, he would use bloody lessons to challenge the American justice system. In the interrogation room, District Attorney Nick didn't directly interrogate him. Instead, he expressed sympathy for Clyde's pain of losing his wife and daughter. But this was only a facade, as the police had no evidence proving that Clyde had committed murder. The case required Clyde to confess voluntarily. To demonstrate sincerity, Nick deliberately turned off the surveillance camera but secretly activated the recording device. He wanted to lure Clyde into confessing. What surprised Nick was that Clyde appeared to be very cooperative. His initial demeanor was always fearful. When Nick asked if he had killed him, Clyde replied, "I hope he dies every day." Nick then asked if he was responsible for the murder of his accomplice. Clyde nodded and said, "That guy has been dead for a long time. I practice every day to learn how to kill these two scoundrels." Nick was very pleased with the answer. It seemed the perpetrator had fully confessed. But unexpectedly, Clyde fixed a sharp gaze on Nick. He advised his opponent not to rush to judgment and told Nick to prepare himself for all the upcoming encounters, as Nick would soon be extremely busy. Those previous answers were just a word game by Clyde. In his testimony, he only intended to confess but had never admitted to killing those two scoundrels. At that moment, Nick realized he had been deceived. However, he used the tactic of victory after victory to negotiate with the criminal. Could there be a bed? This left Nick feeling puzzled. Yet the district attorney thought that a profitable deal like this should be agreed upon. Just a mattress could be exchanged for the criminal's testimony. What was there to lose? But Nick felt that this was Clyde's trick. He didn't want to be toyed with by his opponent. But at that moment, Nick's office received a distress call. A few minutes earlier, Nick's daughter had received a mysterious package. Curious, she put the disc in to play it and trembled all over. Inside was footage of End being manipulated. This act enraged Nick immensely, but the perpetrator in the video was wearing a mask, making it impossible to identify him. This forced Nick to reconsider the previous condition of providing Clyde with a soft Simmons mattress in prison. At the same time, he also instructed his assistant to gather more evidence to see if they could find a new breakthrough. Clyde worked meticulously, putting them in a passive position. At the trial, Clyde once again used practical actions to highlight the flaws in the justice system. Not only did he refuse to confess, but he also requested bail. Clyde deliberately waived his right to an attorney and represented himself. This was the first time he had been charged by the police, yet they could not provide concrete evidence. Moreover, there had been similar cases in the past that had been successful. This tight and reasoned argument left the police feeling profoundly helpless. Ultimately, even the female judge agreed with Clyde and decided to grant him bail. But unexpectedly, Clyde clapped his hands in disappointment. 10 years ago, it was this very judge who handed down a lenient sentence to the two scoundrels who harmed Clyde's wife and daughter, leading him down a path of no escape for revenge. Now the case was repeating itself. Clearly, Clyde had harmed two people, yet the judge was still allowing a murderer to walk free. It's obvious that I just harmed two people, yet you want me to walk out of that door. How mistaken are you? At this point, the courtroom had turned into a noisy marketplace. Clyde disdained the court's charges and rejected the bail, which was the outcome he desired. He was a man of his word, quickly confessing to Nick about the entire process of the murders. This led Nick to believe that they could finally close the case. It seemed this guy wasn't too difficult to handle after all. As usual, it ended too abruptly. But unexpectedly, Clyde wanted to make a deal with him. If the police provided the 5-star hotel bidet before 6 o'clock, he would tell Nick the whereabouts of the lawyer who had defended the two scoundrels years ago. Hearing this, Nick hurriedly instructed his assistant to contact the lawyer's wife. The other party confirmed that her husband had been missing for 3 days. It seemed Clyde was not just talking nonsense. Not long after dinner was brought to the prison. However, the prison director had endured enough of the police's unreasonable demands. He deliberately prolonged the security checks to prove that they could not make arbitrary arrangements. In the end, when the meal was delivered to the cell, it was 8 minutes late compared to the scheduled time. Clyde once again fulfilled his promise by revealing the whereabouts of the lawyer, but because the police did not adhere to the time regulations, he could not guarantee the lawyer's life or death. Nick hurried to the designated location. Sure enough, at the target point they found the lawyer's suitcase, but when they dug up the ground and opened it, it was already too late. Preparing dinner on time was crucial. If there hadn't been an 8-minute delay, the lawyer would not have died. At that moment, Clyde invited his cellmate to enjoy a steak together. He had secretly hidden a sharp knife inside it. Taking advantage of his cellmate's inattention, he suddenly struck. To the accompaniment of the rising and falling background music, his cellmate collapsed. Clyde was considered a dangerous criminal and was kept in solitary confinement in a cold underground cell to prevent him from continuing his aggressive behavior. But what everyone did not realize was that this was precisely the outcome Clyde desired. To understand more about Clyde, the prosecutor used his internal connections to reach out to Clyde's former colleague, a former high-ranking spy. The ex-spy stated that Clyde had definitely angered someone because he was once a king in the espionage world, known for resolving problems that even agents couldn't handle for the Department of Defense. Any targets that fell into Clyde's hands were dealt with quietly. Do you think locking him in a basement would solve the problem? That's only because Clyde wants to take the blame. Every action of his has profound meaning. Nick, feeling overwhelmed, realized he had no choice but to stop Clyde's next move. The advice from the ex-spy was straightforward. Deal with Clyde and the game ends. This was the only way to confront this character. The prosecutor decided to disregard human rights and restrict Clyde's contact with anyone. However, this required the judge's signature. The judge, wanting to take revenge on Clyde, signed the document despite knowing it was unreasonable and incompatible with the law. But shortly after, she was shot and fell to the ground. This bizarre murder made Nick fully believe the words of the ex-spy from earlier. Nick angrily reminded Clyde. On the surface it was an interrogation, but in reality it was a demand for him to stop. Nick believed that even for revenge this was already more than enough. But Clyde, feeling disappointed, replied, "Is that what you think? This is revenge. If this is what you want, I've spent 10 years seeking it." He was fixing the corrupt justice system and wanted official recognition. However, Nick completely misunderstood Clyde's intentions because this case had to involve a lot of bloodshed. At that moment, Clyde once again made a deal. All charges against him must be dropped by 6 a.m. tomorrow. If not, he would kill members of the justice team. Nick didn't believe that a prisoner could orchestrate murders. He was sure he had accomplices outside. But there was no time for an investigation. Nick decided to mobilize all his colleagues to the prison's independent record storage room tonight to prevent any incidents before 6 a.m. The female assistant suddenly asked Nick if he ever regretted his decision to strike a plea deal with Darby to secure a higher chance of winning the case years ago. Nick hesitated for a moment but still believed it was part of his job. Dealing with criminals wasn't just about securing a higher win rate. Sometimes it was about ensuring that criminals were punished, even if only partially, rather than letting them roam freely outside the law. That night everyone was unable to work, occasionally glancing at the clock. There were only 10 seconds left until 6 a.m. Everyone became extremely tense, as if waiting for the announcement from the Grim Reaper. Finally, when the clock struck 6, everyone was safe. Those present let out a sigh of relief. Only Nick still felt uneasy. With Clyde's working style, things were not that simple. Just when the members of the judicial team let their guard down and prepared to leave, disaster struck. The cars exploded one after another. The female assistant reacted too slowly and couldn't get out of the vehicle. She could only helplessly look outside. Nick rushed to rescue them, but as a result 6 members of the judicial team lost their lives. Shortly after, the police found an explosive device nearby. It turned out that bombs had been remotely detonated on the cars of his colleagues. This filled Nick with immense fear. He hurried home to take his wife and children to safety and requested 24/7 police protection. But when he returned home, he was shocked to find a new picture frame on the table. Inside was a photo of him shaking hands with the criminal Clarence Darby. This provocative act made Nick unable to contain himself any longer. He went to the outside of the prison and demanded to see Clyde privately. Seeing the expression of his opponent, Nick couldn't contain his anger. "It was you who targeted me. Don't you dare touch my family." After that, Nick shouted about the torment he had experienced years ago. The reason he made a deal with the perpetrator was that there wasn't enough evidence at the time. If he had insisted on accusing the enemy of killing Clyde's wife, they might have lost the case, allowing both criminals to remain at large. Clyde, well versed in US law, naturally understood this, but what angered him was that Nick had never questioned this corrupt justice system in the past and even struck deals with criminals. "If that's the case, I will use blood lessons to push for reform of the justice system. My previous actions were merely an appetizer." Nick attended the funeral of his colleagues, overwhelmed with emotion. In his youth, he had also dreamed of changing the justice system. But the deeper he got involved in this system, the more he became bound by it, ultimately being assimilated by it. Until Clyde's case arose, causing him to awaken. From that point on, he was determined not to engage in deals with criminals anymore. As people left the cemetery, despite the upgraded security measures, they could not prevent Clyde's plan. A remote-controlled heavy machine gun was aimed at the prosecutor's vehicle. When the trigger was pulled, dense bullets pierced through the car body, striking the prosecutor. Not stopping there, a missile followed. Members of the Justice Agency continuously suffered casualties, causing the mayor to become extremely angry. Nick felt embarrassed and wanted to resign, but surprisingly, the mayor not only did not fire Nick but also promoted him to prosecutor to demonstrate her determination not to yield to the terrorists' threats. At the same time, the entire city entered a state of heightened alert, not allowing any suspicious individuals to linger. To reassure the citizens, the police not only increased patrol forces 24/7 throughout the city, but also had armed helicopters on standby, ready to assist at any moment. Even after going this far, they could not stop Clyde's next plan. After being promoted, Nick finally had higher authority to review the documents. Eventually, he discovered an issue. In Clyde's real estate information, there was a property located near the prison. Nick immediately called the chief of police to investigate. This place, which appeared to be an auto repair garage, secretly had a tunnel dug underground. The two crawled inside and followed the direction towards the prison. Indeed, they discovered a horrifying scene. This place was not only filled with plastic explosives but also stocked with police uniforms and equipment. Perhaps this was the secret base that Clyde had painstakingly built. Even more astonishing, Clyde was familiar with all the passages in the dungeon. As long as he was imprisoned, he could come and go through this tunnel. Such a magnificent construction was truly admirable. To probe further, the chief of police cautiously opened the secure door but found that Clyde's cell was completely empty. In search of Clyde's whereabouts, the two returned to the tunnel and carefully searched, eventually discovering a surveillance room. The police realized that this was the place monitoring the entire city hall, and furthermore, there was an employee ID for a janitor at the city hall. It seemed that the city hall was currently Clyde's target. Indeed, at that moment, Clyde had used the guise of a janitor to sneak inside. He arrived at the designated spot and crafted a massive bomb right on the scene. The chief of police intended to call the mayor to quickly evacuate, but Nick stopped him. Doing so would only raise Clyde's alertness, and he could very well detonate the bomb ahead of schedule. Therefore, the two could only rush to the city hall. From the security guard's account, they learned that a security meeting was about to take place, attended by high-ranking officials from the entire city. The meeting room was arranged on the 6th floor. Nick observed through the surveillance camera and noticed a suspicious janitorial vehicle parked on the 5th floor. Clyde was likely there. However, when they arrived to apprehend him, no one was found and only a suitcase remained at the scene. After a careful operation, the police finally managed to open the suitcase. With so much explosive material, it could easily flatten the entire city hall. Inside was the detonator. Just a phone call could trigger the bomb. The situation was extremely urgent. Since Clyde was monitoring the meeting room, the leaders on the 6th floor could not be evacuated. In this critical moment, Nick had an idea. He wanted to give Clyde a big surprise. Clyde was on his way back when he encountered a police checkpoint, preventing him from returning to the prison in time. Nick had arrived at the prison entrance. When Clyde returned to his cell, he was surprised to find a visitor. Perhaps this was their final confrontation. Nick sincerely urged Clyde to stop killing, to put down the phone, which would also mean letting himself go. Blowing up the city hall might indeed make the city government take the construction of the legal system seriously, but it wouldn't bring his wife and children back to life. They didn't want Clyde to go down this path either. However, Clyde's heart had died along with his wife and children 10 years ago. The only purpose for him to survive was to challenge the judicial system. Clint asked Nick in return. Nick, are you making another deal? This is my final offer. Is anyone there, Clint? You taught me that. Klein nodded slightly, feeling somewhat reassured. His previous efforts had finally started to yield some results. Why is it that only bloody lessons lead to progress? But Klein's goal was the entire judicial system, even if it meant sacrificing lives. Klein hesitated no more. He pressed the call button. Seeing Klein's determination, Nick quickly led the guards out of the cell to avoid harming any innocent people. At the same time, the police chief locked the secret door tightly. The death bell rang from under the bed. When he opened it, he found the bomb suitcase there. Klein suddenly awakened, as if he had sensed this beforehand. He didn't struggle or panic too much. Instead, he calmly faced the impending fate. He held the necklace that his daughter gave him, a feeling of relief rising in his heart after so long. Finally, he could let go of everything and reunite with the wife and children he missed day and night. I was once a law-abiding citizen, but the law could not protect justice for me. Then let me be the glimmer of light in the darkness. Today's story ends here. Thank you for watching the film. What do you think of this movie? Please comment below.